70 years later, these men describe dogfights the same way they describe sweeping up leaves. You sit across from a 98-year-old navigator in his sitting room, surrounded by photographs of grandchildren and a single framed print of a twin-engine aircraft with wooden wings. You ask him what it was like to fly through a wall of anti-aircraft fire over Berlin at 300 feet while searchlights turned night into noon. He considers the question, takes a sip of tea. Well, it was a bit lively, I suppose. Jerry certainly had a go at us that night. A bit lively. The aircraft was doing 400 miles per hour in a shallow dive while he plotted their course through exploding shells. Tracer rounds streaked past his window. The fuselage shuddered as shrapnel punched through the wooden skin. And 7 decades later, the man who was there, who watched his pilot wrestle the controls through a sky trying to kill them, remembers it as a bit lively. That's what this story is about, not the aircraft. You already know about the aircraft. But here's the thing. You need to understand what these men were flying before you can understand what it meant to fly it the way they did. Because the de Havilland Mosquito wasn't just unconventional. It was borderline absurd. The Air Ministry was convinced metal monoplane construction was the only serious approach. De Havilland proposed building a combat aircraft out of wood, birch plywood and balsa wood. The men who flew these aircraft knew exactly what they were made of. They knew the fuselage that separated them from 400-mile-per-hour slipstream was plywood held together with glue. They knew a cannon shell would punch through it like paper. They climbed in anyway. When the Mosquito entered service in 1941, it was the fastest aircraft in RAF Bomber Command. Fast enough to fly unarmed because nothing could catch it. Night fighter, day bomber, pathfinder, photo reconnaissance platform, strike aircraft. The Mosquito did all of it. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, who initially doubted whether a wooden aircraft could survive combat, came to call it one of the most versatile and useful aircraft ever built. One of the best planes ever built, period. But you already believe that. I don't need to convince you. What I need to tell you about is the men who climbed into those wooden fuselages, knowing full well what a cannon shell would do to plywood at 400 miles per hour. And specifically about how those men talk. Because they're dying now, the youngest of them in their late 90s, the oldest past 100, and when the last one dies, something dies with him that cannot be recreated. Squadron leader Tommy Broom flew 83 operational missions during the war. 83. A standard tour was 30 operations. The odds of completing even that were poor enough that Bomber Command didn't like to publish them. Tommy Broom did nearly 3 tours. He flew as navigator with 163 Squadron out of RAF Whiten in Cambridgeshire, part of the Pathfinder Force, the elite units that marked targets for the main bomber force. His pilot was a man named Ivor Broom, no relation despite the identical surname. The pair became known throughout Pathfinder Force as the Flying Brooms. Whiten was a Pathfinder station. The crews there flew ahead of everyone else into the thickest defences to light the way for the bombers that followed. They went first. They took the worst of it. The Pathfinders flew ahead of everyone else into the thickest defences to mark the target for the bombers that followed. They were the men the German gunners aimed at first. The mechanics of Pathfinder operations created a specific kind of terror that other aircrew didn't face. A standard bomber crew flew to the target, dropped their bombs, and turned for home. The Pathfinders had to arrive early and mark the target while completely alone over enemy territory. The stoicism wasn't just style, it was survival. When asked about this in later years, Tommy Broom called the work demanding. Demanding. 83 missions over occupied Europe, any one of which could have been his last. And the word he chose was demanding. The way you might describe a particularly tricky crossword puzzle. Here's the thing about this generation. They didn't talk about what they did. Not really. Not in a way that matched the scale of what actually happened. And that gap, between the magnitude of the experience and the smallness of the language, is what makes their testimony irreplaceable. Flight Lieutenant Roger Calvert was a Mosquito navigator. In an oral history interview preserved in the International Bomber Command Center Digital Archive, he recounts missions over occupied Europe with a delivery so matter-of-fact that you could close your eyes and imagine he was describing his daily commute. The bombing runs, the searchlights, the flak bursting around them, all of it rendered in the same even tone. No elevation, no verbal emphasis. When interviewers ask follow-up questions designed to elicit emotion, "Were you frightened?" the answer comes back in the same register. "Well, one didn't really think about it. You had a job to do, you did it, and you came home." One didn't really think about it. Try that sentence on for size. Imagine yourself in that wooden aircraft, tracers lighting up the night around you, engines screaming, your pilot throwing the thing into evasive maneuvers while you're trying to plot a course to the target and back. And then imagine, 70 years later, saying you didn't really think about it. That's not a lie. It's not denial. It's something else entirely. A way of speaking about violence that treats emotional display as inappropriate, almost unseemly. To speak of your own fear would be to suggest you were exceptional, which would be to suggest that other men weren't afraid, which would be either untrue or insulting to them. Better to say nothing. Better to say it was a bit lively and let the listener imagine what that meant. On February 18th, 1944, Mosquitoes launched one of the most audacious low-level attacks of the entire war. The target was Amiens prison in northern France. The Gestapo was holding French resistance prisoners there, men and women who had been captured running escape lines, hiding Allied airmen, sabotaging German operations. Many faced execution. The mission was to breach the walls and give them a chance to escape. 3 squadrons flew the raid. 487 Squadron Royal New Zealand Air Force, 464 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, and 21 Squadron. Australians, New Zealanders, British, all of them together. The aircraft flew at wave-top level across the English Channel. They climbed to clear the French coast defences, then dropped back down to 50 feet to avoid radar detection during the approach. 50 feet. At that altitude, you can see the expressions on the faces of farmers in the fields below. You can count the cows. The final attack run was conducted at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Bombs released at such low altitude that the Mosquitoes had to climb sharply to avoid their own blast debris. The walls were breached. 258 prisoners escaped through the gaps the Mosquitoes had torn. Group Captain Percy Pickard, the mission commander, was shot down by German fighters after completing his attack. The surviving crews, when debriefed, described the operation in terms that reporters found almost maddeningly sparse. Was it frightening? It was a bit hairy, I suppose. Did they think they would survive? One didn't really think about it. 258 people walked free because of what those men did. Pickard died to make it happen, and the surviving crews described it the way you might describe a difficult drive in bad weather. Some ice on the roads, bit of reduced visibility. Got there in the end. That's the pattern. That's what we're watching disappear. A year later, on March 21st, 1945, 18 Mosquitoes from 140 Wing attacked the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, the Shell House, a 5-story building in the centre of the city. The Danish resistance had requested the strike. They knew the top floors contained Danish prisoners who would likely die in the attack, but they calculated that the documents destroyed and the Gestapo officers killed would be worth the sacrifice. The mosquitoes flew at rooftop level through the streets of Copenhagen, navigating by the spires of churches, releasing their bombs at such close range that debris from the target struck several aircraft. Then disaster. One mosquito struck a lighting pole and crashed. The fire spread to a Catholic school, the Jeanne d'Arc school. Smoke poured into the sky. Other mosquito crews, seeing the smoke and flames and believing it was the target, dropped their bombs on the school as well. 86 children died, 18 adults, nuns, teachers, children who had been in class when the world exploded around them. The surviving crews carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. When they spoke of it, and they rarely did, they spoke with grief. But grief expressed through restraint, through the careful selection of words that conveyed sorrow without melodrama. The mission was ordered. They flew it. Something terrible happened. They came home and flew again 3 days later because that was what was required. They never spoke of it in a way that sought sympathy, never sought absolution. Never asked to be told it wasn't their fault, even though it wasn't their fault. Even though the tragedy was the result of split-second decisions made in impossible conditions by men doing what they'd been ordered to do. That's what makes this footage irreplaceable. Not what they say, how they say it. The gap between the magnitude of the event and the smallness of the language they use to describe it. Wing Commander John Cunningham became the most successful night fighter pilot of the war. 20 confirmed victories, the majority of them flying Mosquitoes with 85 Squadron. The Air Ministry, eager for propaganda but mindful of operational security, attributed his success to eating carrots, a story invented to conceal the existence of airborne radar. Cat's Eyes Cunningham became a household name. In one preserved interview, Cunningham is asked what it felt like to shoot down an enemy aircraft. He pauses, not for dramatic effect. The question seems to puzzle him. He says something to the effect of, "One didn't really feel much of anything. It was night, you see. You saw a shape, you fired, and then it was on fire, or it wasn't. If it was, you reported the claim and went home." One didn't really feel much of anything. This wasn't callousness. Cunningham was by all accounts a gentle man. He lived until 2002, spent his final decades quietly. What this was, what all of this is a cultural register that no longer exists. A way of carrying experience without performing it. And that register is dying with the men who learned it. We need to talk about why they spoke this way. Because it wasn't accident. It wasn't natural temperament. It was survival. The Royal Air Force had a formal classification for aircrew who couldn't maintain their composure under the strain of combat operations. The term was lack of moral fibre, LMF. Men who broke, who refused to fly, who displayed panic, who admitted they were unable to continue, were removed from their squadrons with permanent career consequences. The policy was brutal by modern standards, but the policy shaped the speech patterns of everyone who served under it. To speak of fear was to risk that label. To admit you were frightened was to invite scrutiny. Better not to speak of fear at all. Better to develop a register, a way of talking that kept emotion at arm's length, that described trauma as though it were administrative. A bit lively, bit of a do, rather hairy. These weren't euphemisms chosen for poetry. They were survival strategies. Ways of talking that let you keep flying without inviting the attention of the authorities who could ground you forever. Say the wrong thing in the wrong tone to the wrong flight surgeon and your career was over. Your reputation was destroyed. Your family would learn you'd been found wanting. So they learned to say nothing. Or rather, they learned to say everything in a way that sounded like nothing. Frank Dell was a Mosquito pilot with 21 Squadron. On September 17, 1944, he was shot down over Nazi-occupied Holland. His aircraft was burning. He and his navigator bailed out over enemy territory. What followed was months of evasion, capture, escape, and eventual return to England through the Dutch resistance network. A journey that would make a film in itself. Dell survived to give interviews well into his 90s. When asked about being shot down, his account takes perhaps 30 seconds. The aircraft was hit by flak. It caught fire. They bailed out. That's it. 30 seconds. A modern filmmaker would stretch those 30 seconds into 10 minutes of slow-motion chaos. Dell condensed them because dwelling would be unseemly. The Banff Strike Wing operated from RAF Banff on the coast of Scotland, beginning in September 1944. They conducted anti-shipping operations against German convoys in Norwegian waters, flying at mast height against heavily armed vessels, firing rockets and cannons while taking fire from ship-mounted flak guns. Extraordinarily dangerous work. On April 21, 1945, 42 Banff Strike Wing Mosquitoes engaged 18 Luftwaffe torpedo bombers off the Scottish coast in one of the last major aerial battles of the European War. The men who survived gave testimony in the decades that followed. Low-level attack runs against fortified positions, rockets streaking toward enemy hulls, aircraft disintegrating around them, friends disappearing into the grey water of a Norwegian fjord. All of it rendered in the same measured voice, the same careful understatement. Yes, we lost a couple of kites on that one. Pity. Pity. The man who died in the crash was his friend. They'd played cards together the night before. And the summation is pity. The Mosquito wasn't exclusively British. The men who flew it weren't exclusively British either. Canadians served throughout RAF and RCAF Mosquito squadrons. Australians and New Zealanders flew some of the most dangerous operations of the war, including that Amiens prison raid. And when these Commonwealth veterans gave interviews in their later years, they exhibited the same understated quality as their British counterparts. The cultural register transcended national boundaries. Whether it was learned in training or whether the experience of combat creates its own etiquette, the result was identical. A way of speaking that treats emotional display as inappropriate, that refuses to claim courage even when courage is the only word that fits. George E. Stewart was a Mosquito combat pilot from Hamilton, Ontario. He flew with distinction, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, and remained active in veterans associations well into his late 90s. In May 2024, an aviation historian wrote that Stewart was still alive and wondered whether he might be the last surviving wartime Mosquito pilot. On June 17, 2024, George Stewart died. The blog post was updated with a single addendum: George died today. The casualness of that update, George died today, is itself a reflection of the register we're witnessing disappear. No elaborate eulogy, no performative grief, just the fact stated plainly. The way Stewart himself would have stated a fact about a mission that went wrong. A man who enlisted in the Royal Air Force at 18 in 1943 and flew his first Mosquito operation in 1944 would be 99 or 100 years old today. The mathematics are simple and merciless. The Mosquito Aircrew Association, which for decades maintained contact between surviving crew members, was formally wound up in recent years due to dwindling membership. Each month, each week, the number grows smaller. We're not accustomed to this register. Contemporary culture celebrates emotional authenticity, vulnerability, the visible processing of trauma. We expect war veterans to speak of their experiences with evident feeling. We expect tears, or at least the tremor in the voice that suggests tears are being suppressed. The Mosquito veterans confound this expectation. They appear to feel little, and we must watch carefully the pauses, the slightly averted gaze, the hands that grip the chair arms a fraction too tightly, to understand that the feeling is present but submerged, controlled, kept in check by a lifetime of training and a generation's worth of cultural expectation. That's why this footage matters. That's why it's irreplaceable. The emotion in this story doesn't come from what these men say. It comes from the gap between what they say and what actually happened. The mismatch, the dissonance. An aircraft goes down in a Norwegian fjord, flak bursting, smoke trailing, a friend disappearing beneath the waves. 7 decades later, in a sitting room in Hampshire, the man who saw it happen takes a breath and says, "Yes, we lost a couple of kites on that one. Pity." That gap, that impossible modesty, is what cannot be recreated. Future generations will have access to the technical specifications of the aircraft. They'll have the operational histories, the after-action reports. They'll have the testimonies preserved in archives. But they won't have new testimony. They won't have the living connection to a way of speaking that belonged to a specific generation, shaped by specific historical circumstances. The cultural conditions that produce this modesty no longer exist. We've moved on. And in moving on, we've lost the ability to produce new examples of this archetype. What we're preserving now, in these final years, these final interviews, these conversations with men who were young when the world was at war, is not information. The information exists elsewhere. What we're preserving is the way a voice sounds when it has learned to carry grief without performing it. The slight elevation of an eyebrow to indicate irony. The dismissive wave that accompanies "it was a bit lively." The almost imperceptible catch in the voice when speaking of friends who didn't come home. When the last Mosquito veteran dies, this register dies with him. Not the facts of the war, but the sound of the war as carried in the voices of the men who fought it. The modesty that now seems impossible. The courage expressed through the absolute refusal to name it as courage. Ask one of these men whether he considers himself a hero. Watch his face. The confusion, the faint embarrassment, the almost imperceptible shake of the head. Hero? Good heavens, no. I was just a navigator. Chap in front did the flying. I just told him where to go. A pause, a slight smile, as though the idea of heroism is faintly ridiculous. We got on with it. That's all. Everyone did. When the last one dies, we'll never see their like again. Subscribe for more stories like this.